The electricity died at exactly 7:03 a.m. One moment. Victoria Sterling's $2 million mansion was blazing with crystal chandeliers and heated pools. The next moment, complete darkness. And standing at the electrical junction box on my property, I was holding the switch that had just changed everything. But this story doesn't start with revenge. It starts 6 days earlier, with me digging a simple post hole and a woman who made the biggest mistake of her entitled life. What she didn't know was that my simple ranch sat on the one piece of leverage that could destroy her perfect world. And by the time she figured it out, it was already too late. I bet you've dealt with a neighbor who thought their money made them your boss. Drop a comment about your worst HOA horror story, because trust me, after what happened to Victoria, you'll want to share this with every neighbor who's ever been bullied by a homeowners association. Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m., I was out behind my grandfather's old barn, measuring the distance between two weathered fence posts that had been standing since before I was born. The work seemed straightforward enough to replace a section of the original stone fence that my grandfather built back in 1952. And the same fence that had weathered countless Texas storms and still stood as solid as the day he set those stones with his own hands. My name's Marcus Reed, and at 34, I've spent the better part of my adult life as an independent electrician, working with my hands just like Grandpa taught me. The 12 acres I call home aren't much to look at compared to the McMansions that have sprouted up around me over the past decade. But this land holds something those cookie-cutter estates never will. 3 generations of family history and memories that no amount of money can buy. Grandpa always said this land held more power than people realized. At the time, I thought he was talking about the rich soil or the way the morning light hit the old oak trees. Looking back now, I realize he meant something entirely different. Something that would save me when I needed it most. The fence repair itself was a labor of love. Each stone had to be carefully lifted, the mortar chipped away, and the foundation reset to match Grandpa's original craftsmanship. It was the kind of work that couldn't be rushed. The kind that required patience and respect for the man who'd built it the first time. I was about 2 hours into the morning, sweat already beading on my forehead despite the cool air, when I heard the sharp click of designer heels on gravel. Victoria Sterling approached like a general inspecting her troops. Every inch of her 5'6" frame radiating the kind of authority that comes from years of having people jump when she speaks. At 48, she carried herself with the practiced elegance of someone who'd learned early that appearance was everything. Her platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect bob that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Even at 8:30 in the morning, she was dressed like she had a board meeting crisp white blouse, dilated navislux, and those Louboutin heels that clicked against the ground like a countdown timer. Victoria had been the HOA president for 3 years, a position she'd won not through community service but through sheer intimidation. Her husband Bradley Sterling owned half the commercial real estate in the county, and their 200-square-foot mansion sat like a monument to excess, complete with columns that belonged on a courthouse and landscaping that had won the Community Beautification Award 3 years running. But there was something most people didn't know about Victoria Sterling. Something that explained the steel behind her perfectly practiced smile. She'd been married before, to a young soldier named David Chen, who died in Afghanistan when Victoria was barely 25. The grief had nearly destroyed her, but it had also taught her that the only security in life was the kind you built with your own hands, or in her case, with your husband's money and political connections. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they're about to correct someone they consider beneath their notice. "Are you Marcus Reed?" I set down my stone chisel and walked over to meet her, keeping my voice respectful despite the warning bells going off in my head. "Morning, Mrs. Sterling. Just working on some fence repairs here on my property." She didn't acknowledge the greeting, instead pointing toward the partially dismantled stone wall. "I hope you have proper permits for that construction work. Any modifications visible from neighboring properties require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I pulled out my phone and showed her the county building permit I'd received 3 weeks earlier, along with the property survey that clearly marked my boundary lines. "Everything's in order. Ma'am, this fence sits 15 feet inside my property line, and I've got all the required permits for the stone repair work." That's when I saw the flash of something cold behind her perfectly applied makeup. Victoria wasn't just concerned about permits. She was looking for a fight. What I didn't understand then was that this fence repair represented something much bigger in her mind. See, my little 12-acre ranch sat right in the middle of what Bradley Sterling had envisioned as his next big development project, a $50 million luxury community that would replace working-class homesteads with executive estates. They'd been quietly buying up properties in the area for 2 years, and my grandfather's land was the final piece they needed to make their dream a reality. They'd approached me twice since I'd inherited the property, offering first 800 Ling, then eins, 2 million for land that had been in my family for 70 years. Both times, I'd politely declined. This fence repair wasn't just about maintenance, it was about permanence. About putting down roots that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Mr. Reed, Victoria said, her voice taking on the edge that had made grown men back down in countless HOA meetings. I've reviewed your permit application, and while it may be technically legal, you're in violation of Covenant 4.2b regarding aesthetic sightlines and community standards. Any work that impacts the visual harmony of our neighborhood requires community input. I looked around at the sprawling lots, most of them at least 5 acres, with houses spaced so far apart you could barely see your neighbors. Mrs. Sterling, the nearest house is 300 yards away. I'm not sure how repairing my grandfather's fence affects anyone's view of anything. Her face flushed red, and I knew this conversation was about to take a turn. Young man, I am the president of this homeowners association, and I'm telling you that this work stops immediately. If you continue, I'll have no choice but to contact the sheriff's department. The absurdity of the threat almost made me laugh. Here I was, working on my own property with proper permits, being threatened with arrest by a woman whose biggest worry was whether my stone fence might clash with her imported Italian landscaping. But something in her eyes told me she wasn't bluffing. Ma'am, I understand you take your HOA responsibilities seriously, but I'm not violating any laws or covenants. I'm repairing a fence that's been here longer than most of these houses. Victoria pulled out her phone with the dramatic flair of someone who'd made this exact threat before. We'll see about that. I'm calling 911 right now to report dangerous construction activity and a hostile property owner who's threatening community safety. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Threatening community safety? I was moving stones with hand tools, but Victoria was already dialing, and I could hear her voice shift into the breathless, frightened tone of someone in genuine distress. Yes, I need immediate assistance. I have a neighbor using dangerous equipment and behaving aggressively toward community residents. I'm afraid for my safety. 25 minutes later, Deputy Sarah Johnson pulled into my driveway in her patrol car. I'd known Sarah for about 3 years. She'd hired me to rewire her kitchen after a power surge, and we'd gotten along well. She was in her early 30s. With the kind of practical competence that comes from dealing with every variety of human drama the county could throw at her. Morning, Marcus, she said, stepping out of her car with the tired expression of someone who'd been through this exact scenario more times than she cared to count. Got a call about some kind of disturbance over here. I handed her my property deed, the county survey, and the building permits I'd pulled 3 weeks earlier. Sarah studied the documents carefully, then walked the fence line herself, checking the measurements against the survey markers. Mrs. Sterling, she said, turning to Victoria. Everything here appears to be in order. Mr. Reed is working well within his property boundaries with proper permits. But instead of backing down, Victoria doubled down on her story. Officer, the issue isn't just permits. He's been hostile and threatening. Just because he has paperwork doesn't mean he can terrorize the neighborhood with dangerous construction work. Sarah looked at me with an expression that said she'd been through this exact scenario more times than she cared to count. Not my first HOA rodeo, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. That's when things took a turn that still makes my blood boil, even though I was 100% in the right, even though I had every permit and legal document needed. Deputy Johnson still had to follow county protocol for neighbor disputes. Marcus, I'm going to need you to temporarily cease operations while we complete a full review. County regulations require a 24 to 48-hour cooling-off period for property line disputes involving community safety concerns. She didn't take my tools, but she did hand me a formal warning citation that essentially grounded me from working on my own property because my neighbor had thrown a tantrum. I know this is frustrating, son, but I have to follow procedure. Mrs. Sterling has connections in City Hall, and they'll want everything done by the book. Victoria's smile was pure triumph as she watched the deputy drive away. I was standing there in my own yard, holding a piece of paper that prohibited me from touching my grandfather's fence because a woman in designer clothes had decided my family's legacy was an inconvenience to her political ambitions. You should learn to be more cooperative with your community, she said, adjusting her designer blouse. This neighborhood has standards, and I intend to maintain them. Perhaps next time you'll consider selling to people who actually belong here. I looked her straight in the eye. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something shift inside me. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. Words he'd spoken when I was 12 and dealing with bullies at school. Sometimes, Marcus, patience isn't weakness. It's strategy. I'll remember your face. Mrs. Sterling, I said quietly, and I have a feeling you'll remember mine too. The way her smile faltered just slightly told me she'd heard something in my voice that she hadn't expected. Something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in my kitchen staring at the warning citation and trying to figure out my next move. That's when I heard a knock on my door. It was Ruth Campbell, a 78-year-old widow who lived 2 houses down and had become something of a neighborhood historian over her 25 years in the community. Ruth was holding a manila envelope in her weathered hands, and her usual warm smile was replaced by a look of quiet determination. Marcus, she said, I recorded everything from my kitchen window this morning. That woman lied to the police, and I have proof. Ruth had lived through the rise and fall of 3 different HOA presidents, watching the community transform from a place where neighbors helped each other to a battlefield where property values trumped human decency. She'd seen good families driven out by harassment campaigns, watched elderly residents bullied into submission by violation notices and legal threats. Victoria Sterling has been destroying this neighborhood for 3 years. Ruth continued, pressing the envelope into my hands. She drove out the Henderson family with false accusations about their vegetable garden. She made the Martinez couple remove their kid's swing set because it violated aesthetic standards. And last year, she actually called code enforcement on my son when he came to repair my roof because his work truck was parked in my driveway. The video quality was crystal clear, shot from Ruth's kitchen window with a perfect view of my property line. More importantly, it had audio. You could hear every word of Victoria's lies, every exaggeration, every false claim about feeling threatened by a man who'd been nothing but respectful throughout their entire interaction. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the sheriff's department with a manila envelope full of evidence. The video, my property deed, the county survey from 2020, and the building permits I'd pulled 3 weeks earlier. Deputy Johnson watched the footage twice, and I could see her jaw tighten as she listened to Victoria's fabricated story about feeling unsafe. Marcus, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I can smell a setup from a mile away. Problem is, county regulations still require me to follow procedure. I can't just reverse my decision based on new evidence without going through the proper channels. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples like she was fighting off a headache. Here's what I can tell you unofficially. Mrs. Sterling's got connections with City Councilman Dave Richardson. This won't be your last headache if you keep pushing back. Give me until tomorrow morning to process this through the system, and try to keep your head down in the meantime. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria wasn't going to wait until tomorrow morning to make her next move. I was right. By 3:00 p.m., Victoria was working her phone like a campaign manager on election day. She called Dave Richardson, who she'd met at the country club's charity auction. She called the county planning director, whose wife happened to handle PR for the Sterling Development Group. She even called the editor of the local newspaper, spinning a story about community safety and property values being threatened by hostile neighbors who refused to respect established standards. Her strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Frame me as a dangerous outsider threatening the peaceful suburban lifestyle that families paid premium prices to enjoy. Within 2 hours, every member of our 47-person homeowners association had received an email with the subject line, Emergency Community Safety Alert. Aggressive neighbor threatens resident security. When I pulled into my driveway at 4:30 p.m., I knew immediately that something was wrong. There was a fresh pile of construction debris dumped right in front of my garage door, broken concrete with rusty rebar sticking out, paint cans leaking toxic sludge, rotting drywall that reeked of mold and chemicals. It would cost me at least $500 to have this mess properly disposed of, assuming I could even find a company willing to handle hazardous materials on short notice. But the debris wasn't even the worst part. My security cameras, the ones I'd installed just last month after a string of break-ins in the area, were covered with thick black spray paint. The motion sensors had been disabled, and there was a note duct taped to my front door that said, "Get the message yet?" in handwriting that looked suspiciously like the signature on HOA violation notices I'd seen around the neighborhood. This wasn't just retaliation. This was a declaration of war. And apparently, Victoria had fired the first shot while I was sitting in the sheriff's office trying to follow proper procedure. By 6:00 p.m., the community isolation campaign was already showing results. Tom Wilson, who lived 3 houses down, I called to cancel the electrical work I was supposed to do at his house the next day. "Sorry, Marcus, but my wife doesn't want any trouble with the HOA. You understand, right?" No, I didn't understand. But I thanked him for calling and crossed another $400 off my weekly income. 20 minutes later, I was walking to my mailbox when Linda Hayes, who usually waved cheerfully during her evening walks, suddenly found something fascinating about her shoes and hurried past without making eye contact. That's when I found the first official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. Violation: unsightly materials storage in violation of community aesthetic standards. Fine: $2. Payment due within 10 business days. They were fining me for the debris that Victoria had dumped on my property. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. She'd vandalized my land, then immediately written me a ticket for the mess she'd created. It was like getting punched in the face and then being arrested for bleeding on someone's fist. I sat on my front porch that evening, eating a microwave dinner and staring at the pile of toxic waste that someone had dumped in my driveway. For the first time since inheriting this property, I found myself wondering if maybe I should just cut my losses and move somewhere else. Somewhere without HOA tyrants and entitled neighbors who thought money could buy them the right to control other people's lives. Grandpa never had to deal with this kind of insanity. He'd bought this land back when neighbors still believed in minding their own business and helping each other out when times got tough. But then I walked out to the old barn and ran my hand along his workbench, the same workbench where he'd taught me how to wire electrical outlets and fix broken appliances when I was 8 years old. I could almost hear his voice. "Marcus, running away teaches bullies that they can win. Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, but it's always the thing that lets you sleep at night." I thought about Ruth, who'd risked getting on Victoria's bad side just to help me get justice. I thought about all the other neighbors who were probably too scared to speak up against HOA intimidation tactics, and I realized that this wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about whether decent people could live with dignity in their own homes, or whether money and political connections would always win. I walked back to the house and found my security cameras still dripping with black paint. Someone had not only violated my property but had deliberately blinded my security system while doing it. That's when I knew that tomorrow morning, I'd be installing new camera-hidden ones this time, positioned where they could capture everything while remaining invisible to casual observation. Because if Victoria Sterling wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had evidence of every single move she made. And something told me that my grandfather's old papers might hold more than just sentimental value. "Okay, lady," I said out loud, looking toward her mansion with its perfectly manicured lawn and pretentious marble columns. "If that's how you want to play this game, then game on." What I was about to discover in those papers would change everything between us. But that's where this story takes its most unexpected turn. The harassment escalated over the next 3 nights, each attack more personal than the last. Night 1 brought another diesel truck at 2:30 a.m., dumping metal scraps in chemical containers that made my eyes water. I spent 3 hours cleaning it up and another $600 having it properly disposed of. That's when I installed my new security system military-grade night vision cameras hidden among the trees, uploading everything to cloud storage in real time. If Victoria wanted to play dirty, I was going to document every second of it. Night 2 delivered a different kind of violation. At 1:45 a.m., my hidden cameras caught a figure slashing both rear tires on my work truck. then spray painting "Move Out or Else" across my garage door in red letters 3 feet tall. The tire replacement cost me $480 I didn't have. And I filed a police report that Deputy Johnson was honest about. Hard to prove anything without clearer footage. Marcus. But night 3 was when Victoria crossed a line that changed everything between us. I'd been lying awake since midnight when I heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw starting up near my backyard. I threw on clothes and ran outside. But I was already too late. Victoria's landscaping crew was cutting down the 100-year-old oak tree that anchored my grandfather's memorial garden, a same tree where he'd built a stone bench and carved the dates of his military service. During World War II. This wasn't just property damage, this was destruction of family history. The deliberate erasure of a good man's legacy, standing there at 3:20 a.m. Watching strangers with chainsaws destroy a century of growth and memories. I felt something break inside my chest. That tree represented every story Grandpa had told me about courage under fire, about standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything. For about 30 seconds, I seriously considered marching over to Victoria's mansion and giving her a taste of what real intimidation felt like. My hands were shaking with rage, and I could feel 34 years of being reasonable just evaporating into pure fury. But then I heard Grandpa's voice as clearly as if he was standing beside me. The moment you let anger control your actions, Marcus, you become everything they said you were. I walked back into the house and opened Grandpa's old military trunk for the first time since his funeral. Inside, beneath his Purple Heart and service medals, I found a manila folder labeled Property Documents, Important. What I discovered made my heart start racing. There was a 1,987 electrical easement agreement between my grandfather and the original developers of Victoria's LOTA contract that granted electrical access across my property to power what would eventually become her mansion. But buried in the legal language was a clause that changed everything. Easement privileges contingent upon respectful neighbor relations and absence of harassment or interference with grantor's property rights. Grandpa hadn't just been generous when he'd allowed power lines across his land. He'd been strategic, building in a safeguard that would let his family protect itself if neighbors ever became a problem. I spent the rest of the night researching easement law online, and what I learned made me smile for the first time in 4 days. The harassment clause wasn't just valid, it was ironclad. Every attack Victoria had made, every lie she'd told to police, every violation notice she'd sent, all of it was documented evidence of contract violation. At 9:00 a.m., I called Tyler Bennett, my college roommate who'd become a property attorney in Austin. Tyler, I need you to review an easement agreement. It's complicated, and I think I might have found something important. Tyler's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Marcus, easements with harassment clauses are extremely rare, but they're absolutely bulletproof in Texas. If you can prove contract violation, you can terminate the entire agreement immediately. Are you sure you want to go nuclear? I thought about my grandfather's memorial garden, now reduced to wood chips and hauled away like garbage. Yeah. Tyler, I'm ready to go nuclear. The legal process was surprisingly straightforward. File a notice of easement termination with the county clerk. Include comprehensive evidence of harassment. And wait for judicial approval. If granted, the termination would be immediate and binding, no appeals. No delays. No second chances. By Tuesday morning, my case was officially in the system. My next call was to the power company's legal department, where a helpful attorney explained their obligations. Sir, if you have a court-approved easement termination, we're legally required to disconnect service crossing your property within 24 hours. While I was building my legal case, Victoria was starting to panic. She'd learned about my courthouse visit through her spy network of HOA supporters, and by Wednesday afternoon, she was calling her attorney for emergency consultation. But David Sterling's assessment wasn't what she wanted to hear. Mrs. Sterling, if there's a harassment clause and you violated its terms, an injunction would be nearly impossible to obtain. The law doesn't protect people from consequences of their own actions. Thursday evening, I decided to give Victoria one final chance to resolve this like adults. I found her tending her prize-winning rose garden, the one that had won 3 consecutive community beautification awards. Victoria, I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful, this can end right now. All you need to do is issue a public apology, pay for replacing my grandfather's memorial, and we can coexist peacefully. Her response told me everything I needed to know about her willingness to compromise. I don't apologize to people who threaten my community. This is my neighborhood, governed by my standards. And you clearly don't belong here. She actually used the word my, like she owned every house and every person in a 10-mile radius. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll destroy your reputation, your business, and your future in this town. I tried diplomacy. Victoria, you chose pride over peace. Friday morning at 7 a.m. brought the text message that changed everything. Mr. Reed, Judge, approved your easement termination request. Effective immediately. Saturday morning, 7:03 a.m. sharp. I stood at the electrical junction box on my property with my hand on the main breaker. A crowd of neighbors had gathered for CICs, phones recording, waiting to witness justice finally served. Victoria came rushing out in her bathrobe, hair wild, making desperate phone calls to lawyers and politicians who weren't answering on weekend mornings. Victoria, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. You destroyed my grandfather's memorial to a man who died serving this country. Every action has consequences. I flipped the switch down. The effect was immediate and total. Her mansion plunged into darkness. Air conditioning units went silent. Pool pumps stopped. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause while Victoria sat on her front steps, finally understanding that money couldn't protect her from the consequences of her own cruelty. 3 weeks later, the for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The electrical rewiring estimate came in at $65,000. Her husband filed separation papers, and her property value dropped $300,000 due to electrical issues. My business, meanwhile, was booming. Word had spread about the guy who legally beat the HOA, and I was booked solid for months with clients who respected someone willing to stand up to neighborhood bullies. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's proving that good people don't need power over others to live with dignity. Grandpa's lesson came 40 years late for Victoria, but she finally learned it. Justice, it turns out, really does come through the system. You just have to know where to find the switch.